Okay, so everybody got their idea paper submitted?
Where is it?
Well, some people just probably I mean, who knows how long we'll even stay today. I'll stay as long as you guys have questions or want to talk about idea papers or talk about requirements documents. But, you know, most of what you're doing now is just continuing to work on your documentation towards your project. So some people just don't think they need to ask questions, I guess. It's fine. We weren't going to have quizzes in here or anything. So kind of the punchline. So I will get these idea papers. The goal is to have them graded by tonight. Right, so you should have feedback on Blackboard. I'm busy until 6 p.m. and then I'll probably do dinner. So somewhere starting around 7:30 p.m. until 10 p.m. is kind of the window you should expect to see some feedback, depending on what. Well, I probably hit them in alphabetical order because I think that's the order that it pops up on the screen. So,
Alphabetical like first name or
last name, I think. So if you're early in the alphabet, expect it closer to 7:30. If you're later in the alphabet, expect it closer to 10. But I've committed to get them all done tonight, so you guys have feedback as quickly as possible. If you're very concerned, you can hang out here today, and I can look at it right away if you'd like. Otherwise, it'll be done tonight. So I want to spend today talking about introducing the idea of the requirements document, talking about it in a little bit more detail so you know what you're getting into. I also put a requirements document info doc up here, over here on the left. I found this online. It's actually a pretty well done document. So it talks about a potential format for it. You can use whatever template you want. You don't have to follow this exact template, but what I like about this is it kind of talks about the mentality of what the requirements document is for, who are the audiences for it, and it actually kind of explains some of this stuff. So I link to this, guys. This would benefit you to go through and look at this document and use that as kind of the guide for writing this requirements document. All right, so in general, when so the requirements document is due 1 week from today, so similar to the idea paper. We'll meet as long as we're going to stay today. I'll talk about it here for about 10 minutes or so, and then if you don't have questions, we'll take off. If you do have questions, then we won't. We'll meet again on Thursday in case you are working on your document, you have questions, or you want to ask generalistic questions about it or whatever. So we will meet again on Thursday. It's due next week. Then a week after that is the specifications document is due. So we'll talk about that on next Tuesday. If you want to start researching it and want to work on it earlier, that's fine. But I wouldn't have the immediate goal of getting these documents done. As a whole, I would get the requirements document right. I would say this is arguably the most important of all the documents. So assuming your idea is reasonable. So let's assume that I don't respond back and say, okay, well, this is a garbage idea. There's just no way this is, has the scope for, for this semester, whatever. That's why I want to get feedback to you as quickly as possible. Let's assume that that's not the case, that your idea is at least we can do something with it. This requirements document is probably the most important document because it's really going to be the governing document, almost the contract between you and me in terms of what you say you're going to do and what you actually deliver. All right. So one of the things I do ask you to do that isn't part of the normal template, it's in the assignment for the requirements document, is as you list your requirements, I want you to estimate the amount of time each requirement you believe will take you to complete, so that you almost have some immediate feedback as to whether or not this is in the ballpark of kind of the right size for this semester. Now, keep in mind that your estimation might be completely off, but at least you're going through the process of considering, adding this functionality is going to roughly take me this long. All right. So, but, try to be as honest about it as possible for your own good. Don't say, well, must display username. 225 hours. Something like that. So in any case, the high-level punchline of what the requirements document is a list of all of the features, and this should be a measurable list of all the features that your solution should include. Okay, and it should be a kind of a feature heading, and then a description of that feature. And that description should be fairly detailed. I'm not saying write a 5-page paper for every single heading, but articulate what it means to have this feature. Okay, because it's going to be very easy for you to say, user authentication. Okay, well, in your world, what does user authentication mean? Okay, does user authentication mean that that you're supporting multiple logins, that they must be able to authenticate either through Facebook or Twitter or Google, or whatever, or am I implementing my own authentication thing? Tell me more about what you're thinking, what that requirement actually means, because authentication, while it gives me an idea on what it is, doesn't really tell me what you're looking for. Generally speaking, I would say don't spend, if we're just using authentication as an example, I would not try to make it authenticate for every single possible thing under the sun. Consider the project being a minimum viable product. So if you need to support authentication, fine, pick one. And that's how you'll authenticate with your application. Either use somebody else's authentication solution, write your own authentication solution, authenticate with Facebook, whatever, something like that. But don't try to do a zillion different things, just burning time on authentication. All right, because we want to have a proof of concept. Later on, you can go back through and come up with alternative authentication options. Okay, but punchline being there, don't just give me a line that says one of the requirements is authentication. That doesn't tell me enough. Okay, I want that line to start with, and then I want a little paragraph describing to me what your requirements specifically are as it relates to authentication. Okay, when they authenticate, is this just a username and password? Is it a username and password and a 4-digit code for like kind of dual level authentication? Tell me about authentication. If a sentence or two is enough, great. If it needs to be a paragraph, great. If it's a very specific type of feature, one of the major important features of your application, give me a page or two. Spend time detailing what that requirement is. Because if you tell me, here's requirement XYZ, and let's just say it's literally the heart of your application, using that as an example, whatever that means. It's the major feature of your application. And so you write this little blurb here, and you say out to the side 100 hours. Okay, and I don't really have anything detailing what it is that guy is. What does it mean to fulfill this requirement, or maybe sub-requirements underneath it. So however you decide is kind of most appropriate for your application or your solution, this document can match up to whatever's most important for you. So maybe you have high-level requirements and then the sub-requirements within that. Maybe that's okay instead of writing text. Because at the end of the day, what I want to use this document for is effectively a checklist. Okay? At the end of the semester, I should be able to look at your requirements document. I should be able to look at what you ultimately did. And I should be able to go down that list and check off features. All right? If in the end, you accomplish half the features on your requirements document, that means you only did half of the proposed project. Well, that's not good, right? Okay, so if I'm going to use this as a checklist for your final project, it's pretty imperative that you make this thing thorough, okay, and you fully think it out. Similarly, if you give me a short requirements document that has 5 requirements on it, and I go down the list and I check them all off because you delivered it, and then I look at this and I say, okay, well, he said that this was 75 hours of work, and then I look over here at the project, and it was like just stolen from something, like, some sort of canned solution from somebody else, which is reasonable in an IT project. But that didn't take you 75 hours. That took you 15 minutes with a tutorial to plug that in. I'm going to figure that out as well. And just because you fulfilled everything on the requirements document was not a reasonable representation of what your project should have been. Make sense? So this should be a pretty scary document. This should not be something you can sit down and bang out in an hour. I would expect that most of you should spend 20 hours this week on a requirements document. It should not be a fun experience, but it's going to be an experience that if you spend your time up front thinking about what my application needs to have, and the next week's assignment is the specifications document, which it kind of explodes the idea of the requirements document. It says, how am I going to meet each of these requirements? Specifically, what technology am I going to use? How am I going to architect this thing? Now you've spent the first 3 weeks of the semester considering your project, detailing what you ultimately plan on delivering, and then also thinking about how I'm going to solve that. So at the end of 3 weeks, you've solved the problem. Now it's just a matter of using what you learned in those first 3 weeks to actually implement a solution. All right, so I can't emphasize it enough how important these documents are. Yep.
So is this the do-all document? If you say it this way, you have to do it this way kind of thing? There's no changing it?
No, it could be a living document, but major modifications, you should bring up to me and make sure that that's a reasonable change.
So really it's kind of like a checklist of, hey, this is what we think, this is what we're planning on doing, and you say yes or no kind of thing.
Something like that,
Yeah.
as an initial guess.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
And then as you start getting into the project, maybe it's next week when you start really thinking about the problems and looking into how you're going to solve them in the specifications document, you might say, okay, well, I estimated that this part of the project is going to take 15 hours, but now that I'm looking at this really is a much harder problem than I thought. So I think this is going to be a lot more complex. Now that I'm researching this, I can, really think about this. That's fine. Does something else need to give? Do I need to drop something else that maybe is less important that I put in there as like a feature pad to make sure the project was big enough before? But now it's like, well, this is 3 times more complex than I expected. So maybe I'm going to drop this other feature, and you can maybe document that in the specifications document, and drop a feature because upon further research, which you would do during the specifications document, you determine that something was more complex than you otherwise thought. On the other side, you might go through the specifications document and realize that, oh, I thought I was going to have to write this entire thing myself, and there's actually already a pre-built solution for pretty much exactly what I want. So this is no longer a 75-hour thing, now it's a 5-hour thing. Okay, so now maybe I need to add some more features to this to pad it back out to the kind of the right size project. Yep.
But what you're saying with the spend 20 hours this week on it is try and find that stuff out beforehand so that you can plan for it this week and that you don't have to worry about maybe changing as much stuff next week.
That's true.
Or throughout the project.
Yeah, the hope would be that when you're going through things next week, there aren't major surprises. That you've reviewed the requirements enough and kind of, done the initial little research. So you kind of have an idea how you might solve this. You're going to think about it in a lot more detail next week, but you have a general idea on how you're going to solve this to kind of help you estimate that amount of time that you plan on spending on that. Your time estimates might be off by 60% for all you know, but at least going through that exercise of making a guess. And kind of where this translates to real life is almost, I think it's a fair thing to say, most of the time, people underestimate the amount of time something will take. That's not just with programming, it's really with everything, right? It's like, oh, I could do that in 15 minutes. An hour later, you're half done, right? Okay, same thing's true. We're always going to run into problems. You're always going to run into complications. You're always going to have an aspect of the problem you didn't consider. Like, oh, well, wait a minute. What happens if this occurs? All right, so when you're giving me those estimates on time, try to be conservative, but realistically conservative. If you suspect it'll take 20 hours, don't say 200. Okay, but if you suspect it could be 20 hours, it might be safe to say 30. That's kind of, you're building in some buffer time there because you highly suspect that something is bound to come up in this part of the project. All right, and the worst that happens is it takes 21. Okay, so you have an extra 9 hours in there, but you were at least realistic. So at the end of the day, if at the end of the project you end up spending a little bit less than the total amount of time you were really supposed to spend, but from a planning perspective, what you ballparked was, all reasonable. I'm not docking you points because you were 3 hours short or something like that. As long as kind of everything's above boards and was well thought out and all that stuff. All right, other questions? Okay. Something that typically comes up related to the requirements document is how long should this document be? It's usually a question that gets asked. So the official answer would be long enough to do what it needs to do, right? Consider the job it needs to solve. And as you read through this document, you're going to, some of the headings I liked in here, like why bother with a requirements document? Who's going to use this? So consider the various people that are going to be interested in this document. So on one hand, like something I mentioned, it's an agreement between you and I, okay, for this project, right? Similarly, if I'm not your client, it's also going to be an agreement between you and your client. Okay, so if your client is, you're doing this project for them, this requirements document ultimately says what you plan on delivering for them by the end of the semester. And if at the end of the semester they come back and say, well, why doesn't it do this? You should be able to point to the requirements document and say, well, you signed off on this and this doesn't say it should do that. Okay, and that's actually a very important skill in industry. Okay, it's very important that you capture all the requirements ahead of time and that everybody's on the same page about what the expectation is of what will be delivered. That means what platforms, what features on each platform, so on and so forth. That way you don't have a client come back at the end and say, well, I thought I was getting an Android app. Well, this says only iPhone is the platform right here. Okay. Well, that's not what I thought I was getting. Well, this is what you signed off on. It's kind of the punchline. Now, sometimes that's a tough conversation to have, but these documents are in place to protect you from that type of stuff. Okay. Similarly, if you tell me it's going to be, you're going to have an iPhone and a web-based interface for something, and at the end of the semester you have a web-only interface for it, or even funnier, you have an Android interface for it, then we'll have to talk. And this was, I remember this coming up I think it was last semester for a couple of people in software engineering. It might have been 2 semesters ago. But and some of those people are sitting in this room. I think there was a couple of groups that were working on the same project, just different interfaces for the same project. All right. And at no point in time did these groups actually sit down and think about the requirements or plan out the solution. They just haphazardly, just randomly started working with technologies that weren't even going to be compatible with each other. And in the end, they looked like idiots because they had this completely dysfunctional solution that wasn't compatible with anything they were supposed to do. I think what ended up happening is one of the groups was supposed to solve one half of the problem. The other group was supposed to solve the other half of the problem. They ended up both solving the same half of the problem on the wrong platforms. Something along those lines. Okay, did I get that about right? So these documents are pretty important. Okay, I recognize this is the boring part. All right, so I've been programming for years and years and years and years, and I hate documentation. I hate this part of it. Okay, but it's so vital, especially for large projects. All right, so for those of you who are in the 518 class, starting the Masters of CS program this semester, we've already had 8 hours of contact time in class, and that entire time has been spent architecting a solution. We've written no code in 8 hours of class because we're building a big product, a big solution. And even if in my head I have a decent idea how I'd go about this, because we're doing this for a client, we want to make sure that we've covered our butt for what the client's going to expect us to do by the end of the semester. And we've also gone through these steps of knowing what's reasonable to accomplish in a semester. All right, so I can't emphasize enough how important this document is. This should be a stressful week for every single one of you writing this document. And if it isn't stressful, you did it wrong. Okay? All right, any other questions, comments, concerns? At this point? Go ahead. Well, I guess in terms of what? Like how much you can change the documents?
Yeah, or just how
Well, I would say quite a bit as long as it's within reason. I mean, it's certainly going to be more appropriate for you to come back 3 weeks after the requirements document and say, you know what, I tried to think this through, but I really didn't think this through. And let's fix it then. Then wait till the very end of the semester, and then it'd be a surprise for everybody. So, I guess as much wiggle room as is reasonable. The hope would be that you spend enough time up front here getting it as close to right as possible. Now, having said that, if we're just kind of making a guess, what percent of these requirements documents are likely going to completely capture the final project everybody submits? Probably a very small percentage of them, right? Are going to completely capture it. The hope is that this captures most of it, and that document kind of becomes a living document over the semester, and it kind of gets massaged. We drop a feature. We redesign a feature maybe. Maybe we say it really needs to do A, B, and C, and upon further review, we say, you know what, C is kind of unreasonable, or this just probably isn't going to happen. And at that point in time, a lot of times what has to happen is you might go to the client and you might explain this and say, okay, well, this is kind of an unreasonable feature. I don't think I'm going to be able to pull this off, or I'm not going to be able to pull it off in the amount of time. And then as long as the client says they're okay with it, and as long as from my perspective, it doesn't drastically change the scope of your project, it's still within the appropriate size project for a senior seminar project, then it's acceptable to drop it from the requirements document. In practice, usually that means that you would drop a feature, have an updated version of the requirements document. You probably have like a version number at the top, and then you would have the client sign off, like maybe initial the section where it was dropped. Like the feature would still be in there, but you would cross it out in the document, and the client would sign off on it, kind of approving that this is no longer going to be expected in the end. So again, that deals with kind of the functionality of the document. Other questions?
Because I'm doing like a continuation of my project, should I just make an add or like a version 2 for the requirements document with the features I'm adding in and like kind of perfecting?
Well, yes, but it also has to specify what's already done.
What's already done. Okay. Cool.
Yeah. So the idea is that what I would do, probably the correct thing to do, is you're going to build a requirements document for the entire project, and then part of that's going to be the requirements for features, even features that are already there, and the time estimate for those is going to be 0 because they're already done. So that way, in the end, we're judging that project based on the total requirements that it should meet, not just where you're starting off today. Okay, so really the requirements document then details what features it already has for the ones that have a 0 balance for estimated time. So they're still documented, they just aren't going against what you're expected to accomplish. So if you already have a starting point for a requirements document from last semester, that's fine. But my guess is that requirements document was a smaller scale type requirements document than we really are looking at using in here. We want this to be very much a real life experience that has real ramifications if you don't plan ahead. Other questions? Go ahead.
In past semesters, how much time has the average person actually spent? Do people actually spend 300 hours?
I would say, yeah. The successful students spend, I would say, in that ballpark. Yeah, I mean, typically we paint this class out, and this is not just computer science. I mean, the senior seminar courses across campus, when people do these big presentations and stuff like that, I mean, those are considered to be, capstone, large amounts of work, and 20 hours a week is pretty much par for the course for what the expectation is. I realize that's not necessarily compatible with the modern student, but it is compatible with a college degree. So those are two kind of different things. I realize a lot of people have full or part-time jobs, so an extra 20 hours a week is a major commitment, but
okay, I don't like sleep.
The alternative is that we're handing you a degree based on when you haven't really shown that you're ready to be turned out into the wild. And while several of you might be fine with that, at the end of the day, we have to sign those diplomas and say, yeah, this person graduated with a computer science degree from Concordia, and that means something. All right, so that's kind of the punchline. So I would say that 300 hours is pretty Pretty close. Yeah, by the end of the semester, students usually aren't all that happy about it. But the ones who actually come out with something pretty cool, it also leads to some pretty cool jobs because now you have something legitimate, that you can show to a potential employer that, okay, I built this, I did this. This is something that's on my resume, it's my portfolio. This is something I truly did that I'm capable of. So it's going to be half you learning a bunch and also half you proving to whoever is going to be in charge of you next, let's say your next employer, what you're capable of. So it could also help you get a job. So I would make the assumption that if you're currently working at some place making pizza or something like that, that's probably not your long-term career thing with a computer science degree. Therefore, while I realize you've got car payments and things like that, it might be worthwhile cutting back on your bar time or cutting back on some other things. I was talking directly at you.
I know.
I'm surprised you didn't point me.
Might be worthwhile cutting back on some of those things at the cost of what you might be doing with your life for the next 30 or 40 years. Probably worth it instead of... I follow you pretty close on Facebook. I've seen some pictures. You got a 3-month-long birthday? I thought I was bad. I have a birthday month. Except I spent most of the month sick. But that's actually pretty common for me. I don't remember the last time I wasn't sick in January. It's a thing. All right. So, even when I don't, it's the same thing. Well, I guess I usually go somewhere in January anyways, but I think it's just the time of year. I get sick once per year, and I make it count. It's usually in January. My wife and I were saying that at some point, every single one of us is usually sick on my birthday. That's the punchline every single year. So we can just plan on it. All right. What else? The positive side, though, for this class is that after the first couple of weeks, we don't meet all the time. So the smart student would say, oh, well, that's an hour and 15 minutes, hour and 20 minutes twice a week. So that's that it's free. My teacher's given me that extra time to work on, so that makes a dent in your total hours of your project, right? Yeah, that's not usually the way it's going to work. Just like when you give somebody 2 weeks to do a homework assignment, they still start it morning of, the night before. They slap it together. Same thing's going to happen with this. You guys aren't even going to look at this document until next Monday night. Like, okay, well, time to slap this thing out. How long do you say it needed to be again? He said long enough. All right, well, let's triple space this. All right.
Change that font to 12.5.
And those are always funny too when you adjust it a little bit. You change the margins and you adjust the spacing for the double space, you adjust the font a little bit, and then you look at that and you wonder, can I get away with a little more? By the time you're done, you got size 40 font, it's a single column of characters. It's 1 letter per page. I'm sorry the document's so long. This is 740 pages.
Great.
It really means it's 740 characters long. This thing barely outweighs Twitter. All right. Anything else?
I actually wrote it on Twitter.
Go ahead.
Sorry. How did Jacob Vanderheim pass this class?
My true guess. Obviously, he's pretty bright, right? Yeah, so I think he probably crammed quite a bit of it.
Oh, I can tell you for sure.
Yeah, but what he turned in was pretty solid.
Okay.
So realistically, that was probably mostly leveraging talent, would be my guess. Not necessarily something you should count on, but...
I mean, it was literally the last 2 weeks.
Yeah, it doesn't surprise me.
To 8 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah. No, I get it. Yeah, it doesn't necessarily surprise me, but... when you know him, he's bright, right? So, maybe he has the capability to do something like that, where maybe some of you might not want to rely on that. Evan and Schumacher and Largen, Yenter. Amish probably could swing it.
No, I'm not taking that.
Well, no, I mean that's
I
what
like my sleep a
that's
little
four
bit more
that's
than
4 years of hard work, right? So at the end of 4 years, he's risen to the top. He's pretty good at what he does. So you know, if he had to, he could probably slap something acceptable together in the last week and get through the class. I wouldn't recommend that, but he probably could. Okay, but Largen could not.
See, I'm gonna take that as a challenge.
I mean, I've actually I do this kind of off the record, and it's not really ethical, but I actually have betting lines for every student whether or not they get through senior seminar. Okay, my money's not on you. Well, it is related to you, but not on the success side of it. Okay, yeah, I'm actually all in on that side of it. It's an interesting thing, I think.
Who were the other people in this bed?
Huh?
Who were the other people in this bed?
Well, Haxton has a 991 to 1 chance of failure, I think. Yeah, it's interesting.
At least I know I better odds than Haxton.
There's an interesting show. Where that came from, there's a new show on TV called The Player. It's got Wesley Snipes in it. And it's actually kind of interesting. I think that they've had like 6 episodes. It started near the end of the year. Then they took a break over Christmas and stuff. But the premise is, so there's this guy who's some, really talented FBI agent type person. Very good at what he does. Some security guy, and he gets signaled out by Wesley Snipes and his partner, who run this like under like I don't know, like black market betting thing for like the super wealthy. These people that couldn't go into a Las Vegas casino and bet money because they couldn't bet enough that they would notice. Okay, that's the idea. So there's this whole like underground community of people who literally bet on the outcome of crime. All right, so you have the player, who's like the guy who's trying to stop the crime, and then you have the criminal, the guy who's trying to commit the crime, and then the betting odds are who wins. In that, it's kind of interesting, actually.
What movie is it?
It's a TV show. It's called The Player. The other show that just came out, I think it's in week 2 right now, that's surprisingly good, and this is related, I think, Christian worldview. The show's called Lucifer. Have you seen it?
Mm.
Has anybody watched it? It actually is very good. Yeah, so I mean, the premise is so that, he goes by Lucifer Morningstar, the guy's name, but he's the devil, and he's taking a vacation from hell to come up here and chill on Earth. And he looks, he can choose to look like the devil, but he usually looks like a pretty decent looking guy and that kind of stuff. And he runs a bar and all this stuff. But as he's living with humans, he starts having like emotions and stuff. He like sort of is kind of becoming good. Right, so it's kind of interesting, but then you have the whole, he can get people to tell him the truth about things, and it's better than it sounds like it should be. Seems like. So, I guess I'd recommend that, but you won't have time to watch that, so I would probably DVR it. There you catch up to it in May.
Random number.
All right, anything else?
Like the day after graduation, you just like don't hear from somebody for like
Netflix
4 weeks. Like I'm catching up on the 5 months of.
Well, that's what I did with Walking Dead. I'd seen like maybe 1.5 episodes ever, but then when I got sick earlier this month, I just powered through the whole series. And even my wife's addicted to it now, I think. Did I tell you guys that?
Yeah.
It's like messed up. This is somebody who's like, squeamish with like any sort of blood on TV, and now she's like watching zombie shows. I mean, it makes me uncomfortable. All right. Anything else? Any other questions, comments, concerns? Like I said, I'll have feedback for your idea papers tonight. We'll meet again on Thursday to talk about questions you have in the requirements document. We'll stay as long as it takes, and then we'll go from there. All right. I will see everybody on Thursday.
Yeah, little.
Prove me wrong.